What's up YouTube, JR Flagman here, and today I'm going to show you guys how to wire up these backlights for gauges. Also, you could be installing interior lighting or other small accessories, basically anything that's going to run on 12 volts like the rest of the car that you want to wire into the accessory switch or the light switch. I'm going to show you guys how to do this a couple of different ways, but first let's show you the tools and materials you're going to need. So of course you're going to need the lights or accessories or whatever it is you're installing. The first way I'm going to show you how to do this is going to be real simple if you're scared of cutting into your vehicle's wiring. Maybe you just don't know what you're doing, maybe you don't want to break anything, maybe you're not comfortable doing that. Here's a solution that might be a bit easier for you. What you need to do is go to Walmart. In their CB radio section, you're looking for this adapter that goes to the 12 volt or the cigarette lighter plug, and then on the other end, this was actually originally a black plastic connector for like a CB radio. Just cut that off and strip these wires bare. And now you've got a nice, easy 12 volt, and then we'll be using these butt connectors to connect this bare wire to the bare wires on these bulbs. After that, we'll be using some heat shrink tubing to clean up all the ends. Now, one of these electrical tools here, these sort of multi-purpose plier cutter things, these things are awesome. I love this thing, but it's not 100% necessary. You could probably get away with just some pliers and some side cutters. The second method is going to be for anyone who wants a cleaner looking installation, a bit more professional, so to speak, and a function that is going to be a bit factory. Basically what I want is I want my gauge backlights here to come on with the factory headlight switch, so that whenever the factory gauges are lit, my gauges are lit. Whenever the factory gauges are not lit, my gauges are not lit. That is not something you're going to get from this without some extra manual intervention. So what we need, of course, you need your lights. You'll want this electrical tool again. You'll need your heat shrink tubing. And then you will also end up needing either a multimeter or a test light. Basically, all we're going to be doing is prodding around at some wires, finding out where we have 12 volts with the headlight switch. I grabbed these little alligator clip test leads because it helped me out a lot in finding the right wire. Not necessary, but could be helpful. You'll need just some bare wire. This is way too big a gauge for the task at hand, but it's all I had laying around. Then lastly, you're going to need some soldering supplies, soldering iron, some solder, and some soldering flux. And we're going to make sure that we have nice clean connections. In this case, you could still use our butt connectors here, but I want to go with 100% clean installation, soldered joints, heat shrunk, and no big plastic connectors hanging around under my dashboard. Now, because the gauges I installed are 2 gauges in one cluster here, and I've got 2 backlights to install, I'm going to take the matching wires from each of these lights, and I'm just going to be connecting these together. They're all going to run at the same time. So I'm simply going to strip these wires back, and then just twist them together, so that on my next connection, I'm working with essentially just a single wire each. Now, this first method couldn't really get much easier. You want to get some heat shrink tubing, make sure it's going to fit completely over these butt connectors. Some of these connectors can heat shrink on their own. I just don't really trust it, so just cut up a little section here that'll cover the end. Take your heat shrink tubing, slip it over the wire, and slide it back out of the way for now. Make sure your end is nice and clean, tightly twisted, helps out a lot here. Slip it in there nice and tight into the butt connector. Go ahead and grab, these are the wires from the light. Slip those into your butt connector here. And then we're just going to grab these plier tools here. You could do this with regular pliers if you wanted. Crimp. Crimp down on your wires there. You should have a nice solid connection. You can tug pretty well on that without anything coming out. And then what you'll do, go ahead and slip your heat shrink tubing over the ends, and then grab yourself a lighter and melt that stuff down so it's nice and snug and weatherproof. And then we'll just quickly repeat the exact same process for our negative side. Again, slip our little pieces of heat shrink tubing over, twist the end nice and tight, slip on the butt connector, slip your wires into the other end of the butt connector, get them in there pretty snug. You don't want any play in here. Crimp it down. Oh, coming loose here. There we go. Again, make sure you've got a nice tight connection here. If these are loose, go ahead and grab yourself another connector and try again until you've got a nice tight connection. Again, slip your heat shrink tubing over the ends. This is just for weatherproofing. It should be inside the car. It shouldn't be a big deal, but what's it going to hurt to just waste a little bit of this stuff to be safe? So once we got our heat shrink tubing melted down, nice and snug on there, this is it. This is the whole installation. We are done, ready to go. All you need to do is mount these lights in the back of the gauge or wherever else you might be mounting your accessory lighting. Plug this guy in and you've got light. Let's go check it out. And here we are inside the car. I've just put those lights into the back of the gauges, and now we're ready to try out this other end of our plug. We're going to come on down here, cigarette outlet right there, plug it in, and then we're going to turn on the vehicle and see if we have backlight. Look at that. Both lights functioning just fine. And the behavior is excellent on this vehicle in that the lights turn off as soon as you turn the key off. Some cars aren't going to do that. Some cars are going to have a constant power here, or maybe a constant power for some time after the vehicle shut off. So be paying attention to that, because you don't want to drain your battery just because you hooked up these lights in this fashion. Now our final problem with this installation is that we've got this big ugly wire just hanging out where your legs go, and you don't want to get it tangled, you don't want it to be in the way, and you don't want it to look ugly. So what we're going to do is we're going to unplug this, and we're going to try and find some way to route this in a better way. And on this vehicle, as with a lot of vehicles, you'll be able to tuck it in under the dashboard, and usually you can come in under the steering column. We'll be able to get up under the dashboard there, and then we can run it across under here so that it's completely hidden. If you don't have any way to get behind the dashboard for whatever reason, maybe you could tape it up into any existing crevices or cracks and run it in a hidden way that way. Basically, you're going to need to be a little bit creative, and it will be a little bit car specific here, but I'll show you what I do on this Mini Cooper. And here's what I would consider my finalized version if I were to go with this method, which is that I'm going to tuck it in on the side here. It can slip in with this side panel. That'll be covered up once I put that little cover back on. And then we're going to tuck it underneath the steering column here. This is actually just simply laid across here. You could probably go in and tape it up here if you wanted to be a little bit better about it. And then it's just going to go straight across. You can see it kind of poke out there, and then straight down into there. And then if I ever want to turn my lights off or plug in some other accessory, I can just throw it right there. And the wire's hidden. It's definitely not going to be in my way while I'm driving. So that would be how I completely finish the easy installation. Next, we're going to go about how to do this so that you can wire it in with the vehicle and use existing switches and have a much more factory behavior. So the setup for this second and more professional method is where we're going to get to use our digital multimeter, or if you have a test light, it'll work just fine as well. Basically, we're probing around looking for 12 volts when the light switch is on and 0 volts when the light switch is off. Now, we're going to be hunting around in the wiring for our light switch. Maybe you've got a light switch up in this kind of area, maybe you've got a pull switch, whatever it is, find your light switch, and we're going to be able to get behind it and try and find the wiring that leads to it. Since mine is on this turn signal stalk here, I'm going to be removing this steering column trim. On a lot of vehicles, it's going to be just a couple quick screws or Allen bolts or whatever you got, and then there's probably some sort of clip. And in fact, I already know there's a clip here and a clip here that I'm going to have to get open on each side. And then this bottom trim will pull off, and then the top trim, usually it'll come right off. This vehicle's got this tachometer that's bolted on there, but once we got that off, the top trim will come off too, and we can get all around the switch and try and find the wire that we're looking for. So we've got the steering column trim off, and we have found that on the end of this switch, tucked in underneath here, you can see that tightly wrapped cable. It plugs in right here. Now I could unplug that, but there's not a whole lot of play, and it's pretty tightly, nicely wrapped. I don't want to go about screwing up all that just to find a wire. So I've got a couple other options. A big choice would be to jump down here and start prodding away at some wires, which is going to be a little bit of a task because, again, everything on this vehicle is really nicely wrapped in this nice black anti-vibration stuff. There's some exposed wires over there, but again, to test those, I'd have to cut into them and cut the insulation or find somewhere that they're connected. So an awesome place to check if you can't get in right behind the switch is behind any existing gauges. Gauges are going to have some sort of switch to turn on their own backlight, and we can usually tap into that wire to get backlight for our own accessory if we want it to be off of the light switch. So we're going to take this connector, which came out of the back of the tachometer up there, and one of these wires hopefully will have 12 volts when the light switch is turned on and 0 volts when the light switch is turned off. So here's the setup we've got from the multimeter. We're going to start with our negative lead, the black one. I have used an alligator clip, and I've simply clipped that to the negative side of the cigarette lighter because that's a real safe place to clip it. I know that's ground, and I also know that that's going to hold up pretty well and it's not going to slip off. So we've got a good ground. Now we need to check our power. And because I'm going to be going into this tiny little connector, you can see I've actually already found the correct one. But because I'm going into this tiny connector, what I did is I took a very small strand of wire and I alligator clipped that in there, and then I can prod into each of those very tiny holes and find out which one is which. And again, the other end of that alligator clip is clipped to the probe, which is clipped to the meter. And as I said, we already know this is the correct one. I tried the other ones and none of them came up with this result. But basically, when you're in there, we have 0 volts. We're going to come up, flip our light switch, and look at that, 12 volts, or 11.989796. That's just it slowly draining the battery because I haven't turned the car on. But that's 12 volts right there. I'm going to turn the light switch off, and it dies right back down to 0 volts. So we know that this is going to be the wire we want to tap into, and on this connector, that is that purple wire right there. It's actually purple and red right near the middle. That's the wire we're going to want to splice into for our gauge backlighting. If you were using a test light in this situation instead of a multimeter, you would simply hook up the ground again down there or to the body or anywhere that you know you've got a good solid clean ground, and then again you would fabricate some way to get the probe into each of these little holes, and it simply would have lit up whenever you flip that light switch, indicating that you've got 12 volts there. That's how you would know if you were using a test light instead of the multimeter like I was. So now we're ready to solder. We've got the positive wire from our light bulb. We got the positive wire that we're hooking to the switched wire. Make sure you get your heat shrink tubing set up on there. And we're going to dip these guys into our soldering flux so that we just get the ends coated a little bit. Basically, this stuff's just going to help the solder join these two wires. I'm no good at this. I know there's a few different schools of thought when it comes to soldering two wires together. This is the way I've found, which is to simply twist them together and then drip the solder over that connection. There are ways where you could put the solder on each wire individually and then simply melt the two together afterward. I've tried that. I'm not as good at it, so that's why I shy away from that one. I prefer this method right here, where I simply drip the solder over the joint and then make sure I get the whole thing hot and it flows all the way through and around the joint, and you end up with a nice clean soldered connection. We'll let that cool off for a minute, and then we're going to slip our heat shrink tubing over that, get it nice and cleaned up. But again, you can pull on this pretty well. If you pull on this with even a slight amount of force and it breaks, it's not done correctly, and it's more likely to fall apart inside the vehicle. So here we go. Slip that over there nice and quick, and then we'll go grab our heat source and get that heat shrink tubing shrunk down, and then we'll go install it on the vehicle. Now we're back in the vehicle. We have these lights installed into the back of our gauges, and we have run this power wire down under the dash, and it's going to be ending up into this purple wire. But before we go cutting and splicing, I wanted to mock this up one more time, because you may have noticed I haven't discussed the ground wire yet. And if we look here, these two bulbs, the ground wire is connected to each other, but I don't have this running anywhere. And as far as I'm concerned, it shouldn't have to run anywhere with my specific setup, because this water temperature gauge is mechanical, meaning it has a solid connection, metal connection, going all the way to the engine block, which is, of course, grounded. So, if I'm correct about this, with this mock-up, getting power in, the ground should be able to run through here, just along this metal that would normally be the capillary tube for the water temperature gauge. This will also now act as an electrical ground, and both of these gauges should light up without me specifically taking that ground wire anywhere. So we're going to try this out. We're just going to flip the switch and see if that happens. Well, let's get rid of that light there. Yeah, kind of. I think this one on the right here is just a little bit dimmer. Let's see. Does it get any brighter if I get a better connection there? But it looks like I'm correct. This water temperature gauge is completely usable as is, without running the ground anywhere. And as long as I ground the oil pressure gauge to that same place, that ground works just fine. So that's what we're going to end up doing here. So we're going to ground the oil pressure to the body of the water temperature gauge, and of course that body is grounded to the engine, so we know it's a safe ground. It's good practice to run yourself a dedicated ground in all situations, but in this one, I'm fairly confident that I'm covered, and worst case, I lose a gauge backlight. So if you're installing anything that might be important, make sure that you actually run a real dedicated ground. So now we're back in the car. We've soldered the two ground wires together on the back of these bulbs. Again, that ground is going through the body of these gauges, and then through the capillary tube of the water temperature gauge, and over to the engine. So we're going to basically end up with our backlights being a sort of one-wire system, where the ground is actually through the body of the gauges. And now it is time to commit the act of cutting the factory wiring. This is it. This is when it's going to happen. So if you're unsure of what you're doing, now is the time to stop and either go back and do it the first way I showed you how, the easy way, or take this to someone who knows what they're doing, because cutting the wrong wire here could end up screwing up your car, or maybe you just won't have lights. But either way, you don't want to mess it up, so make sure you know exactly what you're doing. In this case, I've gotten in here a couple times and tried to mock it up with the soldering iron and everything, and I just won't be able to film it the way I want to and get soldering in here at the same time. So we're going to go back and we're going to use another butt connector. We're going to make sure we've got a nice solid connection before we consider this done, because we definitely don't want this kind of thing shorting out, because this will also control the backlight on the tachometer, and we don't want that going out. And there she is. It ain't pretty, but as we can see here, it does work. So it's not great. I'll probably go back and try and fix this again. Now the last thing we have to do is plug in this tachometer again and make sure that the wire is still getting enough juice over to light up the tach. Once it's plugged in, then we're going to put all the trim back together, and again verify that everything works once everything is back together. And there we go. The steering column is fully placed back together. Tachometer is back where it's supposed to be, and other than the one wire going into the side of the dash there, nothing is visible. So now we're going to do one last test here. We're going to shut off the light, we're going to flip the switch, we're going to make sure that both the tachometer lights up and our gauges light up, And then I'm also going to start the car and make sure the tachometer and all the indicator lights still work to make sure we didn't break anything else in the process. Then we'll be good to go. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope this was helpful. If there's anything that I forgot to do, or maybe you have a way of doing it better, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks, guys. Hey, we got lights. And let's see if we have a tack that works. Okay, looks like our lights work. Computer on it works. Hey! Awesome. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Take care. This has been JR Flagman.